I'd like to welcome you to today's Medical Center Hour, a program entitled Making the Best Doctors, Residency Training from Past to Future. I'm Marcia Day Childress from the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities here at the School of Medicine, and I'm pleased to see all of you here today. In the making of a doctor, the residency is the principal formative experience. Its 3 to 9 years of supervised practical learning are the crucible in which medical graduates acquire specialty knowledge and skills, forge a professional identity, and develop the values, attitudes, and behaviors for a lifetime of practice. While there have long been tensions within and around residency, physician historian Kenneth Ludmerer's new book, Let Me Heal, A History of Residency in the U.S. since its 19th century origins, comes at a time when training programs are pressured as never before by government regulation, workforce changes, shifts in disease patterns and sites of care, and a highly commercialized healthcare system. In this Medical Center Hour, Dr. Ludmerer will mine the history of residency in order to address some current concerns about graduate medical education and to assure that we can continue to make the best doctors now for the 21st century. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Ludmerer back to the University of Virginia. His first visit came several years ago, not long after he published Time to Heal, his second book tracing the history of medical education in the U.S. Let Me Heal is the third in his magisterial series on how doctors are made in the United States. His first visit sparked vigorous conversation about our medical curriculum. Perhaps it even sparked early efforts toward UVA's next-gen curriculum, which was implemented in 2010. On this visit, we spotlight graduate medical education, this time to help us think, and we look to Dr. Ludmerer and his deeply informed historical perspectives to help us think about residency training in the various medical and surgical specialties today and tomorrow. It's no exaggeration to say there is no more knowledgeable source on the evolution of residency training than Dr. Ludmerer. But also, and his book makes this clear, how deeply he cares about keeping American medicine excellent in the 21st century, and how much this effort hinges on medicine and society alike, keeping the residency experience excellent, relevant, grounded in good, meaningful work, and thoroughly professional, and of enduring benefit to physicians and patients alike. Dr. Ludmerer's presentation is one of our History of the Health Sciences lectures, produced in partnership with historical collections in the Claude Moore Health Sciences Library. His talk is also the first Joan Echtenkamp-Klein Memorial Lecture in the history of the health sciences, named for our longtime colleague and friend, Joan Echtenkamp-Klein, who, as Alvin B. and Nancy Baird curator, was the heart and soul of historical collections from 1982 until her untimely death early in December of 2015. In her 30-plus years at UVA, Joan built historical collections into the treasure trove and remarkably helpful service it is today. A collaborator and co-conspirator with many of us on many great projects over many years, she was a true and treasured friend of and contributor to the Medical Center Hour. We miss her, all of her library colleagues and others who've worked with her miss her, and we seek to honor her memory going forward. And I'd like to mention today also that Joan's husband, Mike Klein, and her best friend and colleague, Jody Costi from Virginia Commonwealth University, have traveled here from Richmond to be with us today for this occasion. Again, indeed, it actually was Joan who last summer made the invitation to Ken Ludmerer, inviting him to make a return visit. And so it's altogether fitting that he will now present the first Joan Echtenkamp-Klein Memorial Lecture. You'll find biographical information about Dr. Ludmerer in your handout. Immediately following, we'll adjourn to the first floor lobby right outside the front door, the upper door, here in the conference center for a reception courtesy of the Quagmore Health Sciences Library in memory of Joan Echtenkamp Klein. Also, the UVA bookstore is there with copies of Ken Ludmerer's Let Me Heal for sale. And I have to get him to the airport rather quickly, but he might be able to sign a few books on the fly during the reception. So now, Ken Ludmerer, please join me in welcoming him.
Is this on? Can you hear me? Good, thank you. Well, thank you for that kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be back at University of Virginia, though I'm deeply saddened that on the circumstances of the visit, Joan Klein was a wonderful scholar and colleague and friend, good friends throughout the country, not just here locally. We miss her very much. Mike and Jody, I'm just so pleased that both of you can be here today. I thought for this medical center hour, I might review with you the evolution of the residency system in the United States, its current challenges in the residency training, and some potential directions that we might go in the future. There'll be time for comments and questions afterwards, which is always, for me, the most enjoyable part. The material that I'm presenting to you comes from the new book that I wrote, Let Me Heal, which is the first ever account of the residency system in the United States. The immediate genesis of the book was my service on the Institute of Medicine committee that published a report on resident work hours in January 2009. I thought the committee got it wrong and was not pleased with the report that we produced. And that was my immediate incentive to look at the residency system. On the other hand, it wouldn't have been possible for me to have done this without the experience of two earlier books in medical education, Time to Heal and Learning to Heal. So in that sense, the genesis of the project goes back a long way. The residency system as we know it today is multi-year training experience in a hospital after medical school to prepare for a medical specialty, was introduced to the United States and to the world at the opening of the Johns Hopkins Hospital in 1889. But there had to be earlier genesis of this idea, and the roots of the system go to deep into the 19th century. And the roots had, in part, grew from the German university system, but in part from the apprenticeship system. They merged together with the origin of the residency. The original purpose of the residency, as defined by the Johns Hopkins faculty, was to produce the next generation of clinical investigators and clinical teachers and the next faculty. Learning a specialty was considered a byproduct of the experience. Now, not much happened with residency training beyond Johns Hopkins for the next generation or so. But during the 19-teens, it began to spread to other places. The reason not much happened was that medical faculties had too much work immediately in front of them to create the modern medical school. But once, by World War I, that process had been completed, and attention began to shift toward the graduate medical education, and it's this time that the residency system migrates from Johns Hopkins to hospitals around the country. It tended to be brought to new institutions by individuals who had Johns Hopkins connections, people who had done their own residencies at Johns Hopkins and brought the system elsewhere, Johns Hopkins faculty members, and so forth. The next residency to open, for example, was at the Peterbilt Brigham Hospital. Today it's Women at Brigham, where Henry Christian, the chair of medicine, and Harvey Cushing, the chair of surgery, brought the experience to the Brigham that they had known at Johns Hopkins. The purpose of the residency continued to be the same in this second generation, World War I to World War II. The main mission was to produce medical scholars, teachers, investigators. Learning a clinical specialty was a secondary gain. It was designed at this time to be for some graduates of U.S. medical schools, not for all. It was aimed at the elite. So there were first-year residency positions for roughly 25% of the graduating class of U.S. medical schools. And there was further attrition because residency programs at this time tended to be in a pyramid structure, and starting a residency didn't mean you would make it to the top. There was some attrition along the way. So it was definitely intended for the academic elite. It was not the only way an individual could become a specialist at this time. It was one of many competing routes to specialty training, along with European study, a junior apprenticeship to an established specialist in practice, working in the outpatient clinic of a major teaching hospital, and becoming known as a specialist in that fashion. You could get a PhD or a doctorate of science at some universities in a medical specialty at this time. The most common route, and the least satisfactory route, was to go to a commercially driven, individually owned, proprietary postgraduate medical college where you pay a fee, take courses ranging from 2 weeks to 6 weeks, operate in a few dogs, and call yourself an orthopedic surgeon or a neurosurgeon or whatever it may be. It was during this time that the principles of the residency system became firmly institutionalized. There were two core educational principles: the assumption of responsibility. And all of you know this. All of us learn by doing. But the difference between a medical student and a resident is that residents assume responsibility in patient care and are given progressively graded autonomy in making decisions and performing procedures on their own. This was the defining educational characteristic of the residency system. And the other principle was the idea that any patient should be studied in depth. The resident should know the patient thoroughly, reflect on that individual, read, study the underlying basic science, identify all the problems. Today we call it reflective learning, and it's time intensive. It was also during this time that the moral dimension of the residency system was articulated, and this was essentially the value system of the profession: unswerving commitment to solving the patient's problems, placing the patient's needs first. And secondly, this was done by thoroughness and scrupulous attention to detail. And by thoroughness, I don't mean ordering every test in the book imaginable. I mean being careful and not missing things and being attentive to detail. It's tempting when we think about science or profession to think of the internal factors that drive its evolution, and this was certainly true in medicine. But it's also important to recognize that all of us are enmeshed in a broader cultural context. We're all citizens of a society. And these cultural influences, well, not surprisingly, shaped the development of medical education. Three in particular I'd like to draw your attention to today. One, the system of residency training was created during an era of charity care, a two-class system. This is what allowed the principle of autonomy and independence to flourish, because it wasn't all patients that residents operated on and cared for. It was the charity ward patients. Secondly, this was a time before the consumer movement as we know it today. Professional authority was high, so there is very little questioning of the medical profession on internal matters relating to education. And third, cultural attitudes toward work and work-life balance were also conducive toward the hard work of being a resident and indeed being a physician. Ideas of working your way up and completing your education before having a family, and a general attitude toward service. And this was reflected in the comment of William Osler, the Johns Hopkins internist. And you can read it, I'll read it out loud. What about the wife and the babies if you have them? Leave them. Heavy are the responsibilities to yourself, to the profession, and to the public. Your wife will be glad to bear her share of the sacrifices you make. So very typical, and of course the fact that your wife as opposed to your spouse is another reflection of the culture of the period. The learning environment, as we've come to call it, of the residency system at this time was very rich. Time was present, so residents could study their patients in depth. As I mentioned before, the presence of ward patients allowed the principle of autonomy to be implemented. There was great intellectual excitement on the wards as last year patients with ketoacidosis died. This year with insulin they live and thrive. This sense of discovery almost every day. Relationships were close. There tended to be very good camaraderie both within the house staff and between the house staff and the faculty and hospital administration. The small sizes of the staffs contributed significantly to this. And the fact that commercialism was absent at academic medical centers at this time only helped strengthen the patient-oriented commitment to service and the values of the system. The life of a resident was very hard work, exhaustion and sleepless nights were common, all sorts of stresses and strains that are so familiar to residents today. It was a paternalistic environment. Interns were interned to the hospital. Residents resided in the hospital. And many programs, residents were prohibited from marriage. Other programs, particularly in the 1920s, you couldn't leave the hospital without the permission of the head nurse. But there were very positive factors as well that made the hard work seem worthwhile. The rich learning environment that I alluded to, the reinforcement and strength that came from having an active faculty around who knew you and cared about you. And the net result of this, on balance, was that despite the exhaustion and strain that occurred, there tended to be a sense among residents at this time of being engaged in good work. And the better and stronger the teaching program, the more this generalization held true. And no one articulated it better than Lewis Thomas, the great cancer biologist, president of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Institute, and also a great popularizer of medicine and science to the general public. Thomas had been a resident at Boston City Hospital in the 1930s, and he wrote these words: "I am remembering the internship through a haze of time, cluttered by all sorts of memories of other jobs, but I haven't got it wrong, nor am I romanticizing the experience. It was simply the best of times." And this sentiment you find consistently among those who reflected on their experiences from this period. And I've spent some time going into detail about the learning environment for one reason in particular, that if we are to make the residency system better, we have to consider the full conditions of work, not merely the contentious issue of the hours of work, which has been such a concern in recent years. Work hours are but one small ingredient of the total environment and the total issue of the conditions of work. Now, there were very positive aspects of the residency at this time, but also we don't want to romanticize the path either, because the central tension in the residency system was also apparent from the very beginning. What we call the education versus service tension, though economic exploitation of house officers is actually a more accurate term than service. This reflects the dual origin of residency, in part from the university, but in part from the apprenticeship system. So this tension between service and education is present all along. In medicine, of course, we call it stunt work, doing work that non-physicians, that did not require a medical degree to do because it saves the hospital money. This issue was emphasized in their first report on the residency system, entitled Graduate Medical Education, that was published in 1940. And it claimed that the central defect in the residency system is that often there is too little education, too much service. And the worse the educational standing of the program, the more this problem was there. So when you went to some of the small community programs, the balance is tilted the most in the direction of service. And it recommended that residency could be made better. There were a little less service, a little more education. This has been repeated in every official report on the residency system from then until now. Nothing has ever been done about it. It's only received lip service, and the reason is financial. Hospitals have derived too much economic gain from the labor of residents. Now, I mentioned that in the teens, the 20s, the 30s, there were multiple routes toward a career in specialty medicine. This ended with the establishment of the boards in the late 30s and the 1940s. The various boards, American Board of Internal Medicine, American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and so forth, declared that to sit for the board examination, an individual had to have had already completed a so-called long residency in a teaching hospital. By long residency, meaning 3 years or more. So immediately, all the competing pathways towards specialty training disappeared, and by World War II, the residency system had triumphed over the other pathways and had become the sole route to specialty practice. Now, the next generation of the residency system witnessed some changes. This was the time of the triumph of specialization. All hospitals expanded their residency programs. New programs were created, and medical students wanted to take residencies and enter specialty practice rather than general practice. Residency became what I call democratized. Positions became available for every graduate of a U.S. medical school, in contrast to the earlier period when it was only for a select few. This was a time that there was a declining emphasis on research. Residency, particularly at the good teaching programs, continued to be strong professional education, but its purpose changed. Now its main purpose is to produce practitioners in the specialty. Good programs fostered creative thinking, had research opportunities, but it no longer was the way to become a clinical researcher or physician scientist. Individuals with those interests had to get a PhD, go to the NIH, or follow some other research path as well. The paternalism ends, residents move out of the hospital, getting married, residency programs become larger. With this, there was declining sense of the residency program being a family as it had been before the war. But the learning environment remained very strong. Time was present. Residents had the opportunity to assume responsibility in patient care. There was a strong scholarly atmosphere, and service values continued to permeate most academic medical centers. But it's in this time that also we see cracks in the system, particularly in regard to patient safety and house staff faculty interactions. On the safety side, the patients are sicker, and there is also more that medicine can do, because so many patients who before World War II would have died can now be saved by modern medical care. If a resident in medicine had missed a diagnosis of pneumonia in 1931, it really wouldn't have mattered to the outcome of that patient. Now, not only do you need to get the diagnosis right, you need to remember to get cultures before you start antibiotics. You have to know what antibiotics to give and what dosages and how to administer, what the contraindications for, what adverse reactions to watch for. You had to take in mind the patient's complete metabolic and physiological status. You had to know the signs of respiratory insufficiency, know how to intubate, when to intubate, how to manage all the details of a patient on a ventilator. And a mistake anywhere along the line could result in a patient death. And what you find now is that the consequences of errors become greater, but the system of supervision that had worked before World War II no longer is quite as good, and you find a lot of errors beginning to appear, almost all of which had to do with inadequate supervision. And it's also a time that relationships between house staff and faculty tended to decline. Not only are house staff larger in size and faculty is larger in size, but faculty are no longer as visible on the wards. They, instead of doing your clinical research with patients, with observations based on patients, you've now gone to the laboratory and you're studying animals or viruses or rats. So that direct contact is not as strong as it once had been. And this erupted with the discovery of burnout. And there had been studies suggesting burnout in the 1950s and 1960s, and it really became something that people began paying a lot of attention to in the 1970s. The publication of the iconic novel, The House of God, had a lot to do with that. But this is also a time of house staff unions and rebelling against the system. This was the time that medical students and medical residents began publishing memoirs about their experience. Several dozen have been published, each one of which has a dark side to it. And causes of burnout need to be studied more. We have much to learn about it. But two factors in particular seem to stand out at this time. The sense of workloads and exhaustion and fatigue are a big part of it, but that's an insufficient part of it. In addition, the sense of being marginalized from the faculty seems to have been a big component of burnout. The sense that people don't care about me or the work that I'm doing. And this was expressed no better than by Chuck in The House of God. Chuck was the sole African-American physician on the house staff. And in the novel, he comments at one point, how can anyone expect us to care about others if no one cares about ourselves? The root problems of burnout have not been addressed, though there's been a lot of lip service to it. And this issue, of course, continues through the present. The next era in residency system is what I call the era of high throughput. And it begins in July 1st, 1984. And I put that specific date because that is the date that prospective payment went into place for hospitals with the so-called diagnosis-related groups. And this change in hospital financing turned things around 180 degrees educationally. Because before prospective payment, hospitals operated in a fee-for-service system, and the key for their financial success was to keep the beds full. And in such a system, the best thing that could happen would be to have a patient in a bed for 30 days. You get reimbursed for it. Now, with prospective payment, hospitals receive a fee for each admission. And the best way for hospitals to be financially solvent is to increase the turnover of patients. Now, the worst thing that can happen is to have one patient for 30 days because you only get one payment. Better to have 3 patients for 10 days. Better still, 6 patients for 5 days. Better still, 10 patients for 3 days. Or how about 20 patients for a day and a half each because you get 20 payments. So this completely changed environment in our hospitals, both for patient care and education. And there's a lot that can be said about this. I consider this the single greatest problem facing both patient care and education today. It plays out very much in the residency system because suddenly there are too many patients for residents to be able to do their work well. The only way you can get through the very large volume of patients is by cutting corners. That's not good educationally. It's not good for patient care. To give you an example of the numbers, just one program, at Johns Hopkins Internal Medicine, prior to diagnosis-related groups, the average length of stay was 11 to 12 days. Within a few years, it had shrunk to 3.5 days. Before prospective payment, residents were getting 3 or 4 patients a night. Now they're getting 12 to 14 patients a night. So this strain, this high throughput, had very significant effects. Residents could not read. They didn't have the time to read, to reflect, to get to know their patients well. One prominent medical educator wrote an article called Eurekapenia, the lack of eureka moments, aha moments that residents were getting in this new system. It was also by coincidence in 1984 that the issue of work hours surfaced. And this had its immediate beginnings with the Libby Zion case in 1984, where Libby Zion, a 19-year-old, 18 or 19-year-old young woman, walks into the emergency room of the New York hospital with a fever and an earache. 24 hours later, she's dead. And ordinarily, this type of tragedy would not have generated very much attention, as sad as it is, but it so happened that her father was a prominent lawyer and editor at the New York Times, and made a brouhaha of the situation, and events resulted from there. This is greatly ironic because after thorough investigation, it was concluded that her death had little to do with fatigue. It had very much to do with inadequate supervision, as had been occurring for decades. Nevertheless, it became the cause célèbre that began the work hours controversy. Things continued in the 1990s. There were a number of highly publicized cases of medical error and deaths resulting. So Betsy Lehman, a young woman, reporter, I think for the Boston Globe, in her mid-30s, dies at Harvard's Dana-Farber Cancer Institute with a massive overdose of chemotherapy. And this culminates with the publication in 1999 of the Institute of Medicine's report on safety to err is human. And by this time, there was significant public attention to the issue of work hours, and the concern was patient safety. No one was concerned about the well-being of residents. The force behind this was concern about patient safety. In this discussion, as I said, the forces to generate change came largely from outside medicine. You see a lot of consumerism in this, and a lot of loss of trust in physicians. And since the 1970s, you find that the average income of physicians soaring, but the average prestige of physicians and respect by society having an inverse curve. And this certainly played out in the work hours conversation. In 2003, the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, ACGME, established work hour regulations. It was likely that Congress would have passed legislation on its own had the ACGME not acted. And this reduced the work hours to a limit of 80 hours a week. The ACGME also established very rigid lengths of shifts. So if you're on call, you can be in the hospital no more than 6 hours the next day. In 2011, well, I'll get to that in a moment. And a lot of concern came about because of the inadvertent consequence of this strict regulation of shifts. In December 2008, the Institute of Medicine produced a report on work hours recommending even more rigid regulation of shifts. I was on that committee and I thought we missed the boat, and as I said before, that was the genesis of what became Let Me Heal. I was very concerned with the well-being of residents, and we needed that 80-hour limitation, but there were lots of inadvertent consequences of the shift limitation. Residents leaving operating rooms operating on the patient they admitted the night before because they had to leave the hospital, or internal medicine residents leaving a patient with ketoacidosis before the patient was stabilized because the clock says it's time to go. I was hoping we would have flexibility recommended, and the committee did not vote that way. And then there was the report of the committee that was the basis of the 2011 reiteration of the work hour rules, which is the present set of regulations. And these rules were more restrictive than the initial 2003 rules. So now residents have to be out of hospital 4 hours after completing an on-call shift instead of 6 hours as before. The consequences of the work hour rules have been studied, and a lot of information has been obtained, and here's what we have learned. There has been no measurable impact on patient safety. There has been a decline of learning, a decline in the educational value of the residency. Test scores have been falling. Residents will state that they feel less prepared to enter the workforce than before. And in an important sociological study, the observers documented that there was a shift from professional education toward vocational training. There was increased pressure on residents because of the phenomenon of work compression. Though hours were reduced to 80 and the shifts were given lengths, the amount of maximum lengths, the amount of work remained the same. So the residents were with the same amount of work but less a lot of time, and that itself accounted for a lot of frustration and strain and a lot less joy in the work, which is how I got the title Let Me Heal. Residents pleading, let me heal. And a further decline of patient-centered care, because if you're thinking discharge, and discharge becomes your primary goal, as opposed to solving a patient's problems, that's not really, in my view, patient-centered care. There are a number of ways, constructive ways to address these issues, and some of these I've indicated in this slide. In making the residency system stronger, it's important to remember the fundamental point that it's the entire conditions of work that matter and not work hours alone. So the whole experience needs to be addressed. I think much can be accomplished by restoring flexibility to house staff work schedules. To say something like an 80-hour-a-week maximum, but to strictly enforce that. Long call no more frequently than 1 out of 3. 1 day off per week, all averaged over 4 weeks. Enforce those rules and let programs work it out themselves. That would be humane. It's consistent with growing evidence that 80 hours is kind of an optimal balance. But it would allow the gaze of residents to return to the patient and to work rather than to the clock. Another important step would be to, if I could do one thing, it would be to reduce the workload and number of admissions of patients, of residents. This has actually been done at Johns Hopkins, the Bayview Medical Center, the old Baltimore City Medical Center. They have an leaky rotation, as they call it, for their internal medicine residents. Residents on the standard rotation work up 10 or more patients per admitting night. Residents on the leaky service work up 5. Accordingly, they have more time to be thorough with their patients, to reflect, to read, and make home visits. And it has been shown that residents in the leaky initiative learn more, they're much happier, they have a much greater sense of engagement and work. They say things such as, this is why I went into medicine in the first place. They pick up things that they had missed before. They also practice a higher quality care and a less expensive mode of care because they have the time to think about what they're doing. So for example, the 30-day readmission rate on the standard medical rotation is 14%. And 30-day readmission rates, as you know, are considered a proxy for quality and for cost. On the leaky rotation, the 30-day readmission rate is 4%. And those are significant results. The main cost of the leaky rotation is providing the salaries to support the hospitalists and the physician assistants and others who are seeing the patients that the leaky residents are not seeing. And this is being paid for from the earnings of an endowment that a leaky parodi, a grateful patient, provided to Bayview to allow this program to go into effect. So it reminds us that anything we want to do to improve the residency system is costly, and someone's going to have to pay for it if we want real improvement. When I was on the Institute of Medicine committee, the committee accepted this idea, and we hired 2 healthcare economists to estimate what it would cost the country nationwide if every program in every specialty adopted a leaky rotation. And the estimate was $1.7 billion a year. Well, that's a lot of money. This is 2009, not a great year economically for the country. And for a long time, I wondered where we might find the funds. But in July of 2014, the Institute of Medicine published a second report on residency training, this one on the financing of the system. It didn't quote the first report at all, not surprisingly, but it recommended in the report doing away with the indirect medical payments that Medicare currently provides. Those amount to $6.8 billion per year. It recommended doing other things with that money, the largest of which was to create a $4 billion a year educational innovation fund, though it was very vague about what that educational fund would be used for. My thought is that if we're going to put the indirect funds of GME into play, why not use 25% of that to address the most pressing problem in residency education today? It's a thought. In conclusion, I'll say that as I've indicated before, medical education is the dependent variable. The healthcare delivery system is the independent variable. And ultimately, the residency system and all of medical education will go as the healthcare delivery system goes. To the degree it continues on its present commercialized track, in my view, that does not bode well either for patient care or for medical education. To the degree we're able to make it a more patient-centered system of care, then that alone will guarantee better results from patient care and for education. So ultimately, all of education will depend on what directions we go with healthcare delivery and financing. But in conclusion, I'd like to point out that there's a lot that we in medical education can do to help lead toward a better system. Because the pressures in the system, as you know, primarily come from the profound cost of the system in our country. And it's been shown that 1/3 of what we spend has no justification. And I believe this is an opportunity for medical education once again to serve the broader society, to do a better job than we've done instilling in our students and residents problem-solving abilities with their patients, which translates into a style of care that's much more parsimonious. You order things and do things because they are indicated, not because they are there. And immediately you have a form of practice that's higher quality because there's less iatrogenesis. It's also much more economical, and I think can relieve a lot of pressures on the system and help us put a little more time back in the system for those patients who need it. So I think we are part of the solution and not dependent on others. Well, with that observation, I'll conclude here. Thank you all very much for your attention. I know you're busy and have many important things to do. Thank you for being here, and I'd be glad to answer any questions or comments.
Thank you so much. And we do have about 10 minutes for your comments and questions. And this is really an incredible opportunity to sort of talk to the oracle on residency, the historical perspective, but also thoughts, as you've heard, toward the future. So when you ask your question or give a comment, please do identify yourself. And we'll bring the mic to you.
My name is John Davis. I'm an old-timer here. I really enjoyed that very thorough review. You never mentioned Medicare. It was my feeling over the years that when Medicare came along, it changed a huge amount of the dynamics of medical education. Suddenly there was this influx of money for new faculty to increase really the patient care system. And I saw that many of the faculty went into research and other things that put more pressure in some ways on the residency because it diluted the contact with faculty. And there was so much emphasis on the chart. And I remember going to the school play, the senior play one of those years, and saying, the chart is the patient. And I said how true that was, because all of the effort was to get the notes on the chart, and there were all of these problems, especially I remember at Mass General, where John Knowles was brought down to testify. A lot of the professors that had signed charts weren't even there. And he said, well, they're still responsible, and everything went through, but the faculty and house staff had to have notes every day showing they were there and it was going on. And the whole thing was to get the chart. And I just saw that as a major impact on the way we did things. Not necessarily bad in the long run, but it was a real ripple at the time. I wonder what your view is. I didn't hear you mention it. I wonder what you thought.
Well, you're quite right, and I thank you for that comment, that Medicare was hugely transformational in medical education. In the book, as well as in an earlier book, Time to Heal, I go into that in more detail. Now, in one way, it's a godsend because you have a lot of patients who have not been getting medical care or have been inferior medical care who now can get good medical care. It certainly was a godsend for the medical schools and hospitals because you're getting paid today for patients that yesterday you were caring for free. For a while, when there was much less rigid examination of expenses, it opened up this huge stream of clinical income, which for a long time subsidized other activities at academic medical center. It allowed house staff salaries to start to rise and to go from nominal to essentially that of the average, the median income of a family for that region. So a lot of good things happened, but there were a lot of inadvertent consequences as well, which we're experiencing now. It helps, it moved the medical schools away from academic pursuits into clinical care to compete with practitioners of clinical care. There was a huge transformation there. It helped drive the charity out of medicine. It's hard to believe today because everything is so commercialized. But before the passage of Medicare, academic medical centers were considered one of the country's greatest philanthropies, both for the free care the hospital provided, as well as for physician fees, which were not collected. Of course, that all changes. So it really did impact in significant ways, some of which were good, some of which, in retrospect, were not so good.
Yeah, Andy Sutherland, I'm the neurology residency coordinator. And sort of to pick up on what you said about the medical education following healthcare delivery, do you have a comparable observation about how medical training happens in other countries, say in Europe and in Canada? I had a chance when I was a resident to go to Scotland, for instance, and I found that their registrars had more time to spend with patients and to sort of ruminate on their disease models and so forth, but perhaps weren't as didn't feel as rigorously trained as their perception of trainees in the United States. So I wonder if you have a comment there.
Well, every country is different. The United States has been the model of excellence. So, and we need to remember that in my view. In many of the European countries, work hours have been significantly reduced. Not patient loads, work hours. So that has led to, in the view of the wisest educational minds in Europe, significant difficulties, large number of patients, and it's great having a 48-hour week. But from the resident standpoint, it's just, if medicine is a calling, it's hard to act in that fashion. Patient loads are high, throughput is high, so you have those problems as well. And actually, when the Institute of Medicine committee was meeting, we had representatives of several European countries, medical representatives, pleading us not to do in the United States what had been done there.
Other questions, comments?
Hi, I'm John Ashley. The New York Times yesterday, I think, or the day before, talked about the inability to fill geriatrics fellowships across the country, and made the comment, sort of similar to yours, that the funding for those, or at least the desire of residents to go into those fellowships, was diminished because their reimbursement was low. There was very little procedures and income generated through geriatrics, and yet we see radiology and surgical procedural fellowships full. What is the implications of how we're going to care for the primary care needs of old people and others if nobody's going into those kind of specialties?
Well, I think you all hear the question. I wouldn't say that nobody is getting in, going into them, but some specialties are more popular than others. It's always been the case, and that continues to be the case today. There are profound income differentials among specialties. But I would submit that if you are looking at the issue of specialty choice, and by the way, in the book, in Let Me Heal, I go into detail in this issue of specialty choice. There are many other factors as well that influence it. I think it would be a mistake to reduce specialty choice to compensation alone. It has much to do today with perceived lifestyle of the specialty and work-life balance, which is an issue with medical students and residents that generation today as opposed to previous generations. It's important to look at perceived intellectual satisfaction of the field also. So one of my favorite examples is 1970s ophthalmology versus otolaryngology. Both had similar lifestyles. Both were high-paying surgical subspecialties. Ophthalmology was considered hot. It was very hard to get a position. Otolaryngology was easy to find a position. It had to do with the perceived dullness of otolaryngology at that time versus intellectual excitement of ophthalmology. Another example is radiology, which always has been a well-paying specialty and always has had an easier lifestyle vis-a-vis some of the other specialties, but was considered very boring and had difficulty attracting people to until the 1970s. And what changes is the advent of non-invasive imaging, and all of a sudden radiology becomes hot and exciting. So all of these factors enter into the specialty choice issue, and not reimbursement alone, though it is a factor.
Hi, Dr. Ludmerer. I'm Muncie Weaving. I certainly enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much. I would love to, I've lived through most of the eras that you described, and happy to still be going. But it would be wonderful to have multiple sessions on parsimonious care, because I think that almost everything, as I've seen over the years, has worked. We used to order with people in the hospital, for example. You could order a test, and you touched on the lupus, and you could wait for a result, and then you could go to the next stage. You could go sequentially. Now, you have to get everything at once, whether you need it or not, almost, because the days in the hospital are so important. And the other thing is technology has swept over. You know, physicians can get things, see things that we had no idea you could ever do. And I think it would be wonderful to have sessions on parsimonious care. I think it's a very difficult thing to achieve.
Yeah, I agree that that would be a wonderful thing to do. I think that the single most important thing that medical educators can do is to do a better job of teaching that. We've always given a lip service, but we've never done it. And the only thing different, 2015 versus 1915, is that our menu of things to choose from is larger and they cost more. But that same flabby thinking process, let's get it all and see what the data shows, is still there. And the short length of stay does serve as a force to, well, let's get things now, wait. But there's still a lot we can do to achieve better parsimony, and a lot of things we can do to compensate for that. So I personally would be a little reluctant to say we just have to give up with that. And by the way, I'd like to say to all the students and residents here, you know, we get together, we talk about problems of medicine and so forth, as we should, because the only way we can get things better is by tackling our problems head on and working for solutions, whether it's a more technical scientific issue or something relating to the healthcare delivery system. But healthcare delivery systems change and evolve just as scientific knowledge does. And these things will work out. And I still think that despite these issues, it's a good thing we're dealing with these issues and thinking about them. But despite them, in my view, this is the best time ever to be starting a career in medicine. If you look at the best reasons for becoming a physician, it's to help your fellow human beings and the intellectual excitement. No better time ever. And these other things will work themselves out. But to you guys, I'm jealous because I really am, because you have your entire career in medicine ahead of you, and I only have part of mine left. So I wish we could trade places.
And unfortunately, we have none of our hour left. So again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for being part of the first Joan Eckenkamp-Klein Memorial Lecture in the History of the Health Sciences. We invite you to join us for a reception right outside the upstairs door. And also there are copies of Let Me Heal available for sale. Again, join me in thanking Ken Ludmerer. It's been a total pleasure to have you here and a profound learning experience. So thank you.